Picture a room bathed in silver. The moonlight cuts through a single pane of glass, casting long, sharp shadows across a heavy wooden desk. At the center of this desk sits an ancient, copper-wound metronome. The brass weight swings back and forth in the quiet dark. It strikes a steady, unrelenting rhythm of exactly 60 beats per minute. This is not a random tempo, it is the exact average resting heart rate of a human being buried in deep sleep. The metronome does not think and it does not dream. It simply marks the passage of time, ticking away in the shadows, measuring out the borders of a physical reality it does not fully understand. You are listening to it right now. We rely on physical instruments like this to anchor ourselves to the waking world, to prove that time and space exist outside of our own heads. But the truth of your existence is far stranger and far more terrifying than the steady rhythm of a swinging pendulum. Imagine cognitive scientist Anil Seth walking into a dimly lit bedroom late at night. The shadows in the room are deep, and the silence is heavy. As he crosses the threshold, his eyes lock onto something terrifying in the corner. There is a man standing there, perfectly still, lurking in the dark. Instantly, the scientist's heart rate spikes far beyond 60 beats per minute. Adrenaline floods his bloodstream, his pupils dilate, and his muscles tense for a sudden fight or a desperate flight. The threat is absolute. The man is real. But then he reaches out and flicks the light switch. The harsh yellow light floods the space, and the terrifying intruder instantly vanishes. In its place is a mundane, harmless object. It is just a winter coat draped carelessly over the back of a wooden chair. The adrenaline begins to recede. The heart slows back down. For a moment, you might laugh this off as a simple trick of the light, a minor glitch in the visual hardware of the human eye. But to a cognitive scientist, this fleeting moment of nighttime terror reveals the most profound and unsettling secret about human existence. When he saw the intruder, he did not see raw visual data and then accidentally misinterpret it. He actually saw a man. His brain created the man out of nothing. Perception is not a passive process of taking in the world like a video camera recording a scene. It is an active, continuous, and desperate act of creation. Consider the physical reality of your own brain. It is a 3-pound mass of wet biological tissue locked permanently inside the pitch-black, silent vault of your skull. It has no windows, it has no direct access to the outside world. It sits in absolute darkness and absolute silence, receiving nothing but a constant barrage of meaningless electrical static traveling along your nerve fibers. From this chaotic storm of electrical impulses, your brain must blindly guess what is happening on the outside. It uses your past experiences, your current context, and your deepest evolutionary expectations to constantly generate predictions about the world around you. It builds a 3-dimensional model of reality and then projects it outward. Your senses simply help to correct or confirm those guesses. When the sensory data from your eyes and ears lines up with the brain's internal model, the prediction is confirmed. Light, sound, texture, and motion shape those predictions into a perception that feels solid and reliable. This seamless matching process is what we casually call reality. But when the incoming signals break down, or when the light in the room is simply too dim for the eyes to gather enough data, the brain's uncorrected guesses take over. It fills in the gaps, makes assumptions, and projects its own fears into the physical space. The hallucination becomes untethered from the environment. As Anil Seth describes it, your entire waking life, your everyday perception of the world around you, is simply an externally guided hallucination. You do not see reality as it is. You see what your brain believes is most likely to keep you alive. This brings us to a quiet, devastating realization. You have never actually seen the real universe. almost everything you believe to be an objective property of the cosmos is an invention of your own neurology. The brilliant blue of the daytime sky, the sharp, physical boundary of the chair you are sitting on, the warmth of the sun on your skin, and the familiar geometry of the faces you love. These things do not exist out there in the dark void of the universe. They are highly customized renderings, painted by your biological hardware to help you navigate a chaotic universe of raw matter and energy. You are forever locked inside that dark, silent vault of bone, experiencing nothing but a private simulation playing entirely inside your own mind. Even when the world feels crystal clear, what you see is still just a best guess, refined moment by moment. You are the solitary audience member in a dark theater, watching a film that is constantly being generated just milliseconds before you experience it. Every sunset you have ever admired, every face you have ever recognized, and every room you have ever walked into was constructed in the dark. The metronome ticks on the wooden desk, 60 beats per minute. You hear the sound, but even the sound is an illusion, a hallucination of air pressure waves interpreted by the dark machinery of your inner ear. If your current reality is just a best guess, a biological story spun from electrical static and memory, what happens to the reality you have left behind? The ancient, copper-wound metronome continues its steady rhythm on the heavy wooden desk. 60 beats per minute. Each swing of the brass weight strikes the air, measuring out a relentless linear march. In the physical universe outside your skull, this is the inescapable law of reality. Time acts as an arrow, flying in only one direction. Entropy increases, structures decay, moments vanish into the dark, and the past is endlessly ground into dust. We live moment to moment, from the past to the present toward the future. But within the silent, 3-pound universe of your brain, that physical law is entirely broken. Your mind refuses to accept the forward march of the metronome. It has evolved a beautiful, terrifying mechanism to grab time's arrow and forcefully bend it backward into a loop. Imagine psychologist Endel Tulving observing the architecture of human cognition, realizing that we possess an impossible ability. He was studying what is known as episodic memory, the mental vault of our personal experiences. He observed that when a human being remembers a specific event from their past, they are not merely reviewing an old file or reading data from a ledger. They are engaging in literal mental time travel. When you recall the smell of rain on your childhood street or the sound of a loved one's voice, you are reactivating an ancient experience and reliving it in the present moment. Your brain reconstructs the scene, the physical feelings, the sights and the sounds, pulling a vanished world back from the void. Through episodic memory, the past is never truly behind you. It is a live resource that constantly loops into your waking awareness. Tulving even discovered that the exact same neural systems used to remember the past are hijacked by the brain to imagine the future. When you plan for tomorrow, your mind pulls fragmented pieces from past experiences to build a synthetic picture of what might come. You are a creature trapped in a mental loop, perpetually using the ghosts of yesterday to hallucinate tomorrow. But there is a fatal flaw in this time machine. Most of us walk through our lives harboring a deep, comforting assumption. We think our memory works like a video camera. We believe it passively records life exactly as it happens, storing perfect snapshots in a mental archive ready to be played back with flawless fidelity. The reality uncovered by decades of cognitive psychology is far more unsettling. Memory is not a video recording device, it is a live, reconstructive storyteller. When you summon a memory, your brain does not pull down a perfectly preserved photograph from a shelf. Instead, It scrambles into the darkness of your neural networks and begins assembling a stage set from scratch. It gathers scattered, decaying fragments of sensory input, a lingering emotion, a piece of out-of-context knowledge, and stitches them together. And like any desperate storyteller, your brain prioritizes coherence and meaning over cold, objective accuracy. When it finds a gap in the timeline or a missing piece of the scene, it does not leave a blank space. It simply invents a detail to fill the hole. It smooths over inconsistencies, makes rapid assumptions, and weaves entirely false elements into the fabric of your life just to ensure the narrative makes sense. You might vividly recall a birthday cake that was never baked, or believe your friends sang a specific song that actually belonged to a completely different year. These are not intentional lies, they are the artifacts of a mind doing its job too well. A false memory can arrive with the exact same warmth, the identical emotional punch, and the same rich visual detail as a perfectly true one. This is because the brain builds both truth and fiction using the exact same biological tools. Confidence is merely a feeling, not a truth meter. When a memory feels crystal clear and absolute, it often just means the story your brain invented fits together perfectly. The mind despises uncertainty. A gap in understanding feels like an unbearable itch. To avoid the chaos of an unresolved past, your perception acts as an invisible editing room. What you experience as a crisp, factual playback of your history is actually a highly polished, heavily patched, theatrical production that your brain directs in real time, just milliseconds before you perceive it. This reconstructive nature of the mind leads us to a deeply terrifying realization about the continuity of your identity. Because your memory is not a fixed archive, the physical architecture of your brain demands a devastating price for the ability to look backward. Each time a memory returns to your conscious mind, it does not act like a solid object. It becomes briefly flexible. It becomes vulnerable. As you recall the event, you inevitably mix it with your current mood, your new context, and the beliefs you hold today. A conversation you had years ago might be colored by a photograph you saw yesterday, or a confident suggestion from a friend. And when the thought fades and you put the memory away, you do not store the original version. You store the newly edited version. Every single time you remember a cherished moment, you overwrite it. The very act of remembering is an act of destruction. Over time, as a memory is recalled, altered, and saved again and again, it can drift entirely away from the truth without you ever feeling it drift. This carries an unsettling implication. Your sacred personal history is a constantly mutating fiction. The memories you hold closest to your heart, the foundational stories you replay the most often to remind yourself of who you are likely the least accurate. They have been pulled out, edited, and overwritten so many times that the original truth has been permanently erased beneath layers of revision. Your mind retroactively paints your history to protect your fragile self-esteem and maintain a stable identity. The inner autobiography you carry is not a locked vault, it is a living document. When your self-image changes, the past gets quietly edited to match. You reinterpret your old mistakes as profound lessons you always understood. You remember your past choices as far more sensible than they actually were. You soften the memories that clash with the person you desperately want to be today. This isn't malice, it is a biological requirement for survival. A coherent self-story helps you function in a chaotic world. But the terrifying cost of this stability is that you are walking through life anchored to a history that never truly happened. You are a ghost inhabiting a biological machine, dreaming of a past that is being continuously rewritten by the present. Every atom in your body has been replaced, and your most defining experiences have been paved over by the storyteller in your skull. The metronome ticks in the dark, indifferent to the stories we tell ourselves to survive the passage of time. But if your past is a story you are rewriting, Who is the author? Listen again to the metronome sitting on the heavy wooden desk. Tick, tick, tick. Exactly 60 beats per minute, echoing in the quiet dark. In the physical universe, that swinging brass weight only moves in one direction. Time is an arrow that flies strictly forward, driven by the relentless, irreversible flow of entropy. The physical world cannot remember, a shattered glass cannot reassemble itself. The cosmos is trapped in an eternal, fleeting present. But inside the pitch-black vault of your skull, your mind stages a quiet, impossible rebellion against the laws of physics. Your brain refuses to stay in the present. Imagine the psychologist Endel Tulving sitting quietly in his study in the late 20th century, contemplating a human ability so common that we have entirely forgotten how miraculous it is. Tulving observed that humans possess a cognitive superpower that defies the forward march of the cosmos. He called it episodic memory, and he realized that it allows the human mind to bend time's arrow into a loop. When you remember a specific moment from your past, a childhood birthday party, the smell of rain on a familiar street, or the exact words someone said to you yesterday, you are not simply reviewing a dusty, static file. You are reactivating an experience and reliving it in the present. Through memory, you are mentally traveling backward, looping through time to re-experience what has already vanished from the physical universe. It is deeply comforting to believe that your episodic memory works like a video camera, faithfully recording the events of your life exactly as they happen, ready to be played back with perfect objective clarity. But psychological research has revealed a far more unsettling reality. Memory is not a recording device, it is a live, reconstructive storyteller. Every single time you remember an event, you are not pressing play on a stored video. Instead, you are rebuilding a scene from scattered pieces, like a stage crew frantically assembling a theatrical set in pitch darkness. The brain pulls in fragments of sound, flashes of visual imagery, and echoes of meaning, and then desperately tries to fill in the missing parts with whatever usually makes sense. Your mind hates uncertainty, so it smooths over the gaps and inconsistencies. It might exaggerate certain details, alter the sequence of events, or even add entirely false elements simply because they help the story make more logical sense. The brain prioritizes meaning and coherence over strict factual accuracy. What you perceive as a flawless replay of your past is, in fact, a highly edited reconstruction, a mental narrative stitched together just milliseconds before it enters your conscious awareness. You might vividly recall a birthday cake that was never actually baked, or believe your friends sang a particular song that actually played at a completely different event. The terrifying part is how normal and authentic this feels from the inside. We assume that if a memory feels warm, detailed, and emotionally powerful, it must be true. But confidence is a feeling, not a truth meter. A completely false memory can arrive with the exact same warmth, vivid detail, and emotional punch as a genuine one, because the brain builds both truth and fiction using the exact same biological tools. Give the mind a few believable cues, a familiar setting, a trusted family story, and it will dutifully supply the rest, quietly misfiling its own vivid imagination as actual history. Certainty in the realm of memory simply means that a story fits your current view of the world, not that it ever actually happened. This reconstructive process comes with a profound existential risk. Each time a memory returns to your conscious mind, it becomes briefly flexible, vulnerable to the environment of the present moment. Once you have finished recalling the event, it is stored again, but in its newly revised form. A conversation you had afterward, a photograph you looked at, or even a single, confident suggestion from a friend can seamlessly slide into the reconstruction. Over time, the memory can drift entirely, mutating without you ever feeling the shift. It still feels like the exact same sacred moment, but it is a new, overwritten version. Most people carry an inner autobiography that is less like a locked vault and more like a living, breathing document. When your self-image changes, your past gets retroactively edited to match. You remember your old choices as more sensible than they actually were. You reinterpret awkward mistakes as profound lessons that you always fundamentally understood. You soften memories that clash with the person you want to be today. This retroactive editing is deeply stabilizing. It helps you function and trust your own intentions, but it also means you become entirely blind to your own patterns because your mind paints them as reasonable after the fact. You might confidently claim you always knew a past relationship would fail when, in reality, you were completely oblivious. You might recall being fearless in a moment when you were actually terrified. The benefit is psychological continuity. The devastating cost is factual accuracy. This editing process is amplified by the way the mind struggles to hold multiple realities at once. Once an event happens, it becomes the only path you can see, and alternatives fade like unlit roads. The brain treats the actual outcome as inevitable, whispering to you that it was always meant to turn out this way. This hindsight bias makes your past feel predictable, neat, and tidy. It allows you to fixate on tiny choices that supposedly changed everything, blinding you to the chaotic, random webs of possibility that actually define the moment. The mind prefers a clean narrative, and inevitability is the cleanest narrative of all. Here lies the unsettling implication that strikes at the very core of your identity. Every time you remember a cherished moment, the last conversation with someone you lost, the precise feeling of your first love, the defining triumph of your youth, you are overwriting it. By the mere act of remembering, you are corrupting the original data. This means that your sacred personal history, the foundation upon which you have built your entire life, is a constantly mutating fiction. The most treasured artifacts of your past are the ones you have remembered the most often, which paradoxically means they are the ones most likely to have been altered, edited, and rewritten. You are walking through a gallery of your own life, where the paintings change their colors every time you look at them. The exact same neural machinery that loops backward into the past is also responsible for projecting you into the future. When you imagine next week's plans or dream of a future goal, your mind is simply pulling fragmented pieces from your past experiences to build a hypothetical picture of what might come. The past is not strictly behind you, it is an active, swirling resource that constantly loops into your present awareness to help you guess what happens next. You use the fictions of your reconstructed past to hallucinate the possibilities of your unwritten future. Psychologist Dan McAdams recognized that because our memories are so fluid, the self is not a fixed, unchanging core. Instead, identity is a narrative we are constantly editing as we live. You do not just live your life, you actively shape the story you tell about who you are. You highlight certain events as turning points, leave other moments in the dark, and continuously reinterpret your past failures and quiet childhoods depending on the mood, context, and the message you are currently trying to construct. Your identity is an ongoing live edit. You are the author of a biography that changes its plot every time you turn the page. The copper-wound metronome on the wooden desk ticks on, marking the relentless forward march of physical time, 60 beats per minute. It cannot go back. But inside the theater of your mind, time is a loop, a story you constantly rebuild from scattered fragments in the dark. Your past is not a solid foundation of absolute truth. It is shifting sand, a narrative that you are helplessly rewriting with every passing day. But if your memories are unreliable, and your past is a story you are continuously rewriting, who exactly is the author? The copper-wound metronome sits on the heavy wooden desk, swinging back and forth in the quiet dark, slicing the silence into perfect, even moments. Tick, tick, tick. Exactly 60 beats per minute. As you watch the brass weights swing, you do not question its physical existence. It is a solid object. It has a definite, unyielding boundary. Where the cold copper ends, the empty air of the room begins. The metronome does not bleed into the desk, and the desk does not blur into the shadows. In the physical universe, objects have limits. We walk through our lives harboring a deep, comforting assumption that we operate by the exact same physical laws. You look down at your own hands, at the lines on your palms and the familiar texture of your skin, and you believe that where your physical flesh ends, the rest of the universe begins. You believe that the boundary of your physical self is an objective, biological fact, hardwired permanently into your bone and sinew. You assume that your body is a fixed vessel that belongs entirely and exclusively to you. But the silent, dark vault of your mind harbors a much stranger and far more fluid reality. Imagine a quiet, sterile laboratory. A human participant sits at a simple table, their arms resting flat on the cold surface. A researcher steps forward and places an opaque screen on the table, completely hiding the participant's left hand from their own view. In its place, resting on the table directly in front of the participant, the researcher places a lifeless, fake substitute. It is a rubber hand, molded and painted to mimic human flesh, but clearly a piece of dead, inanimate matter. The participant stares at the rubber hand. They know it is fake. Their conscious mind understands that this is a simple, psychological setup. But what the conscious mind knows is entirely irrelevant to the ancient, predictive machinery operating beneath the surface. The researcher takes two small, soft paintbrushes. With slow, deliberate, agonizingly precise movements, the researcher begins to stroke the hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand simultaneously in the exact same rhythm. Stroke, stroke, stroke. At first, the participant simply watches a brush move across a piece of molded rubber while feeling the physical bristles move across their hidden skin. It feels like a clever parlor trick, but as the seconds pass, as the visual and tactile timing align perfectly, the brain begins to solve a terrifyingly complex puzzle. Remember that your physical brain does not have eyes, it does not have hands. It is a 3-pound mass of wet tissue locked permanently inside the pitch-black, silent vault of your skull. It has no direct access to the outside world. It sits in absolute darkness, receiving nothing but a constant barrage of meaningless electrical static traveling up your spinal cord and along your nerve fibers. From this chaotic storm of electrical impulses, your brain must blindly guess what is happening on the outside. It must constantly ask itself a fundamental existential question: what belongs to me? Because your mind cannot see the body directly, it relies on incoming sensory data to draw a continuous map of your physical self. It looks for patterns, it hates uncertainty, and it desperately seeks a coherent narrative to make sense of the chaos. And right now, sitting at that laboratory table, the data is conflicting. The eyes report a hand being stroked on the table. The nerve endings report the physical feeling of bristles touching skin. To resolve this conflict, the mind makes a drastic, instantaneous decision. Vision and timing often win the argument. The brain updates its internal map using the evidence that seems most logically consistent. In a fraction of a second, a bizarre and profound shift in perception occurs. The participant stops feeling the brush on their biological hand hidden behind the screen. The feeling of touch is suddenly projected entirely into the rubber substitute. The participant genuinely, vividly feels the touch on the fake hand. The brain has smoothed over the inconsistencies, actively claimed ownership of the inanimate object, and woven it seamlessly into the physical boundary of the self. This desperate search for coherence reveals the terrifying flexibility of what you consider to be your flesh. To prove just how deeply the mind has been tricked, the researcher suddenly pulls away the paintbrush, reaches for a heavy hammer, and violently smashes it down onto the rubber hand. The participant instantly, violently flinches. Their heart rate spikes, adrenaline floods their bloodstream, and in many cases they experience a sharp, distinct flash of real, physical pain. When the hammer strikes the rubber, the terror is absolute. The mind does not pause to intellectually reason that rubber cannot bleed. The fast, unconscious pathways of the brain bypass logic entirely. The threat is perceived, the protective alarm is triggered, and the pain is synthesized and delivered to awareness. Why would a human being feel real pain in a piece of inanimate rubber? Because pain is not a direct, objective readout of tissue damage. Pain is a protective decision the nervous system makes, using signals from the body and expectations from the brain. The brain's map of the body is a fluid prediction. When the researcher smashed the rubber hand, the brain genuinely believed that a piece of its own flesh was being annihilated. It generated a spike of stress and a profound sense of pain to protect an object that had never once drawn breath. This illusion is not a party trick. It is a haunting demonstration of how body ownership is constructed, not guaranteed. Your brain maintains a dynamic, constantly shifting map of your physical form, and it updates that map based on whatever sensory evidence makes the most logical sense in the moment. This fluid mapping is the exact same neurological mechanism that explains the haunting phenomenon of phantom limb pain. When a person loses an arm or a leg, the physical tissue is gone, but the brain's internal map of that limb often remains intact. The mind continues to project its awareness into empty space, maintaining ownership over a ghost appendage. It will hallucinate an entire physical reality, sending pain signals to a hand or a foot that no longer exists simply because the neural map has not yet been rewritten to accept the loss. This is also why when you hold a hammer or grip a steering wheel or wield a paintbrush, those inanimate tools can begin to feel like literal extensions of your physical body. The feeling of mine, the absolute conviction that an object is part of yourself, is just a neurological prediction that can be rewritten at any moment. Evolution designed your brain to be highly adaptable, allowing you to use tools seamlessly and navigate a changing physical form as you grow. But the devastating side effect of this adaptability is that the structural integrity of your identity is an illusion. We have spent centuries debating the existence of a soul, wondering if a spiritual essence inhabits our physical form. But the phantom body reveals an even stranger paradox. Your physical form itself is a kind of psychological phantom. You navigate the world believing that you are anchored behind your eyes, an undeniable mass of cells operating in a physical environment. Yet if the environment provides the right sequence of visual and tactile cues, your mind will effortlessly disown its own cells. It will exile its own biological hand to the void of the unperceived, casting it out of the narrative entirely. The real, breathing tissue sitting behind the screen is effectively amputated from your consciousness. To your brain, it simply ceases to be yours. Here lies the profoundly unsettling implication that strikes at the very core of your existence. The boundary of what you consider you is completely arbitrary. Your mind is so desperate for a coherent story, so terrified of unresolved sensory conflicts, that it will readily abandon your own biological flesh and claim dead matter as its own living body. You do not live inside your physical body. You live inside a highly unstable, easily manipulated mental simulation of your body. Your flesh and bone are merely the scaffolding upon which your brain hallucinates a shape. The solid, unyielding borders of your identity are nothing more than a temporary agreement between your eyes and your skin. And if the sensory data changes, your brain will betray your flesh without a second thought, extending your soul into rubber, wood, or steel just to make the math work. You are a ghost haunting a machine, but the machine is not fixed. Its borders are drawn in shifting sand. The steady ticking of the metronome tries to convince you that reality is stable, that physical objects have undeniable limits. But within the dark theatre of your skull, your form is constantly melting and reforming, expanding and contracting, a phantom shape forever searching for a place to anchor itself. This desperate search for coherence continues even when your eyes are closed. The copper-wound metronome sits on the heavy wooden desk, swinging back and forth in the quiet dark, slicing the silence into perfect, even moments. Tick, 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 exactly 60 beats per minute. In the physical universe, objects naturally seek a state of rest. A pendulum eventually stops swinging. A dropped stone hits the earth and settles into the dirt. A taut string, once plucked, eventually stops vibrating and returns to silence. The physical world despises unresolved tension. It always moves toward equilibrium, toward an ending, toward a quiet completion. But inside the silent, dark vault of your skull, your mind operates by a completely different, deeply unsettling set of rules. Your brain does not easily return to a state of rest. It has evolved an incredibly powerful mechanism to hold on to tension, refusing to let the pendulum stop swinging until a task is completely finished. Imagine a bustling cafe in the 1920s. The air is thick with the rich, bitter aroma of roasted coffee and the heavy smoke of tobacco. The room is a chaotic symphony of human activity, the clinking of fine porcelain, the sharp ring of the cash register, the overlapping chatter of dozens of intense, overlapping conversations. Sitting quietly at a small corner table is the psychologist Bluma Zygarnik. She is not there to enjoy the pastries. She is there to observe the incredible, invisible machinery of the human mind at work. Her attention is drawn to the waiters navigating the crowded, chaotic floor. To the untrained eye, these waiters appear to possess a superhuman cognitive ability. Zygarnik watches as a single waiter approaches a large, demanding table. He takes a massive, complex order, multiple different coffees, specific modifications, various cakes and strudels, and he does not write a single word of it down. He simply nods, turns on his heel, and vanishes into the kitchen. Minutes later, he returns, delivering every single item to the exact right person with flawless precision. He balances the tray and the information perfectly. The waiter's mind is acting as an ironclad vault of information, keeping a perfectly accessible, highly detailed ledger of exactly what is owed. But Zygarnik notices something far more fascinating than the waiter's ability to remember. She notices his profound, immediate ability to forget. The moment the patrons finish their meal, the moment the coins hit the brass tray, and the bill is finally settled, a dramatic psychological shift occurs. Zygarnik observes that if you stop that exact same waiter just a few minutes later and ask him what that specific table had ordered, he will draw a complete blank. He will hesitate. The flawless, ironclad mental ledger has completely dissolved. The complex details that he held so perfectly in his mind just moments before have evaporated into the smoke of the cafe. Once the transaction is completed, the memory is wiped clean. Zygarnik realized that this was not a quirk of the restaurant industry. It was a profound revelation about the architecture of human attention. She returned to her laboratory and designed a series of careful experiments to test this invisible phenomenon directly. She brought participants into the room and gave them a sequence of simple, focused activities: solving math problems, piecing together puzzles, drawing specific geometric shapes. For half of the activities, the participants were allowed to work peacefully until the task was fully completed, but for the other half, the researchers stepped in and abruptly interrupted them mid-task, forcing them to stop before they could reach a resolution. Later, when Zygarnik asked the participants to recall the activities they had worked on, the results were striking. The people remembered the interrupted tasks significantly more often and with far greater vividness than the tasks they were allowed to finish. This phenomenon, now known as the Zygarnik effect, dictates that interrupted or incomplete tasks create a lingering mental tension. Your mind treats an incomplete action as an open loop, a piece of unfinished business. The brain refuses to let the pendulum stop swinging. It holds the unresolved task in a state of high accessibility, keeping the neural pathways active and engaged. Once a task is completed, that mental tension resolves, the loop closes, and the brain feels entirely free to let the information go, wiping the slate clean, just like the waiter at the cafe. This mechanism evolved for a brilliant, necessary reason. In the harsh environment of our ancient ancestors, forgetting to finish a critical task like securing a shelter, tracking prey, or tending to a fire could mean the difference between survival and death. The brain developed the Zygarnik effect as a biological survival tool, a built-in alarm system designed to keep essential, unfinished goals right at the forefront of your conscious awareness until they are safely resolved. But in the modern world, this ancient survival mechanism has become a psychological trap. You are no longer just tracking a single hunt or building a single fire. You are navigating a vast, abstract web of perpetual incompletion. Think about the structure of your everyday life. You start writing an email, but someone knocks at your door, and you have to leave the message half-written in your drafts. You get into a tense, unresolved argument with a friend, and the conversation is cut short before a conclusion is reached. You begin a complicated project at work, but the day ends before you can find the solution. You leave the office, you go home, you try to rest, but you cannot. The tasks keep tapping you on the shoulder. Because of the Zygarnik effect, your brain does not leave those unfinished tasks at the office. The mind holds on to these open loops because they signal incomplete goals. Leaving a task unfinished keeps it highly active in your neural networks, acting exactly like a blaring alarm clock that has not been switched off. You are attempting to sleep, but your mind is running dozens of heavy background programs, desperately trying to keep track of the unpaid bills of your life. This is why cliffhangers in television shows keep you frantically watching the next episode. And it is why an unfinished to-do list can linger in your thoughts long after the lights are out. The mind despises the unresolved. This brings us to a deeply unsettling implication about the very nature of your waking reality. Because your brain is designed to discard completed tasks and fixate on incomplete ones, your conscious awareness is fundamentally skewed. The triumphs you have completed, the problems you have successfully solved, and the relationships you have peacefully resolved are quickly filed away and allowed to fade. They do not demand your attention, but the failures, the procrastinations, the unsaid apologies, and the abandoned dreams, these remain active. Your mind is constantly haunted by the unresolved. You are not experiencing a balanced, objective view of your life. You are experiencing a reality heavily weighted toward your unfinished business. Your perception is dominated by the tension of what you have failed to do. If you look closely at your own inner life, you will realize that you are building an entire psychological landscape out of the things you failed to finish. Your identity, Your stress and your daily thoughts are sculpted by the ghosts of incomplete actions. You carry a silent, heavy architecture of open loops wherever you go. Every project you abandoned, every ambition you gave up on halfway through, every conversation you were too afraid to finish, they are all still running in the dark background of your mind, drawing cognitive energy, creating a perpetual state of psychological tension. You are a creature composed of unresolved endings. The metronome on the wooden desk continues to tick, 60 beats per minute. A perfect, resolved action with every swing. But inside the dark theatre of your mind, there is no such peace. The mind refuses to rest. It continues to pull the uncompleted past into the present, haunting you with the echoes of everything you left undone. We spend our lives desperately trying to close these loops, trying to settle the bill so our minds can finally experience the quiet relief of forgetting. And the heaviest unresolved tensions are the ones we feel before we even have the words to describe them. The ancient copper-wound metronome on the heavy wooden desk continues its unrelenting rhythm in the quiet dark. Tick, 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 exactly 60 beats per minute. This tempo represents the quiet, automatic baseline of a human body at perfect rest, the steady state of a nervous system that feels entirely safe in its environment. When you sit in a silent room, listening to the predictable swing of that brass weight, you feel a profound sense of control over your own inner world. You believe that you are the absolute master of your psychological domain. You assume that your emotions are rational conclusions, deliberate responses that you consciously author after carefully evaluating the world around you. But what happens when that steady, 60-beat rhythm is violently shattered? The truth about human emotion defies our deepest assumptions about self-control. The heaviest and most overwhelming feelings we experience are rarely chosen. They are biologically enforced, originating in the dark before we even have the words to describe them. Imagine the pioneering researcher Joseph Ledoux standing in a quiet laboratory, peering into the deepest, most ancient architecture of the human brain. He was attempting to map the hidden geography of fear, tracing the microscopic neural pathways that govern our survival. For centuries, we believed that emotion followed a logical, linear sequence. We assumed that if you encountered a threat, your highly evolved cerebral cortex would first analyze the danger, consciously decide that you should be afraid, and then kindly instruct your body to begin sweating and trembling. Ledoux discovered that this comforting sequence is a complete illusion. He focused his research on a tiny, almond-shaped cluster of neurons buried deep within the brain called the amygdala. What he found there completely dismantled the idea that your conscious mind is in charge of your feelings. Ledoux discovered that the brain actually processes emotional information, especially threats, along two entirely different pathways. There is a slow pathway which sends sensory data up into the cerebral cortex for careful, rational evaluation. This is the pathway that allows you to logically understand a situation. But there is also a fast pathway, an ancient neural superhighway that routes raw sensory data directly into the amygdala, completely bypassing the conscious, thinking parts of your brain. Imagine walking down a dimly lit street late at night when a sudden, explosive noise shatters the quiet. Your body does not wait for your conscious mind to evaluate the sound. Long before your cerebral cortex can logically determine whether the noise was a gunshot or just a car backfiring, the fast pathway has already sounded the alarm. In a fraction of a millisecond, your heart rate violently spikes, adrenaline floods your bloodstream, your muscles clench tight, and your posture shifts into a defensive crouch. Your physical body reacts blindly to the environment, launching a full-scale survival response before you even know what you are reacting to. This lightning-fast response system evolved for a brutal, mathematical reason. In the harsh environment of our ancestors, hesitation was deadly. Evolution decided that it is far better to jump at a shadow and be wrong than to slowly analyze a predator and be eaten. The brain's deep emotion systems initiate reactions automatically, prioritizing sheer speed over accuracy. The shocking reality is that your conscious awareness is not the pilot of this emotional response. It is merely a passenger that is informed after the fact. Emotional responses begin as automatic, unconscious physical shifts in the body, a racing heart, tense muscles, before the conscious mind has a chance to catch up. Emotion begins entirely as raw body data. Your brain is constantly scanning and reading a massive stream of physiological signals from your gut, your chest, your skin, and your face. It monitors the precise rhythm of your breathing and the tension in your jaw. When a rapid physical shift occurs, the brain receives this chaotic biological weather and desperately tries to make sense of it. Only afterward does your mind decide what the feeling should be called. This brings us to one of the most fascinating and unsettling mechanisms of the human mind. The exact same physical sensations can mean wildly different things depending on the narrative your brain decides to attach to them. Consider the feeling of a racing heart, shallow breathing, and a tightening in your stomach. If you are sitting across a table from someone you have just met and are deeply attracted to, your brain reads this physical data, looks at the romantic context, and labels the sensation as excitement. But if you experience those exact same physical sensations while walking alone through a dark parking garage, your brain reads the exact same body data, looks at the threatening context, and labels the sensation as dread. The body simply speaks in raw physical sensations, not in intellectual labels. The label only arrives when the conscious brain takes that physical data and rapidly matches it to a story that seems to fit the environment. You do not experience an emotion and then react. Your body reacts, and your conscious mind invents the emotion to explain the reaction. Here lies the deeply unsettling implication that strikes at the very core of your perceived free will. You rarely choose your feelings. Your physical body reacts blindly to the environment, and your conscious mind simply invents an intellectual story afterward to explain the panic. We desperately want to believe that we are rational, thinking creatures who occasionally feel emotions. In reality, we are highly emotional, biologically reactive creatures who occasionally manage to think. When you suddenly snap at a loved one, or feel a wave of irrational anxiety wash over you in a crowded room, or find yourself paralyzed by an unexplainable dread, you are not making a conscious choice. Your nervous system has detected a cue, perhaps a tone of voice, a subtle facial expression, or a shadow, and triggered a physical cascade before you were ever consulted. Once the body is flooded with tension and the heart is hammering against the ribs, the conscious mind hates feeling out of control. The mind despises uncertainty. So, to protect its own illusion of authority, your intellect rapidly drafts a story to justify the physical panic. If your body feels agitated, your mind will instantly look around the room and find something to be angry about, simply to make the physical agitation make logical sense. You might convince yourself that you are furious about a minor comment your friend made, when in reality, your body was just physically stressed from hunger, a lack of sleep, or a sudden noise. Your intellect acts as a desperate public relations department, constantly spinning narratives to explain the blind, automatic reactions of the biological machine you are trapped inside. When you fully grasp this, the geography of fear becomes a terrifying landscape to navigate. It means that your deepest convictions, your sudden bursts of anger, and your overwhelming moments of anxiety are often not grounded in objective truth. They are just the stories you tell yourself to explain the sudden, violent shifting of your own internal chemistry. You are a ghost riding a biological machine that is reacting to a world you cannot fully see, governed by ancient survival codes you did not write, and flooded with chemicals you cannot control. This mechanism is not just limited to fear, it dictates the entirety of your emotional life. Every rush of joy, every sinking feeling of disgust, and every sudden flash of anger begins as a secret, physical shift below the threshold of your awareness. Your mind is perpetually playing catch-up, forever translating the mute, blind language of the flesh into the articulate, rationalized stories of the self. You walk through your life believing you are the author of your emotional reality, but you are merely the narrator, desperately trying to dictate a story that has already been written by the deep, dark structures of your brain. The ancient metronome continues to swing on the heavy wooden desk, attempting to keep a steady, rational 60 beats per minute. It reminds us of how fragile our baseline of calm truly is. At any moment, an unseen cue in the dark can bypass your logic, hijack your heart rate, and force your mind to scramble for a new explanation. We spend our entire lives trapped in this cycle, experiencing the weather of our biology and then desperately trying to name the storm. We invent stories for our emotions, but we also invent stories for each other. Listen again to the ancient copper-wound metronome sitting on the heavy wooden desk. Tick, tick, tick. It strikes the silence at exactly 60 beats per minute. If you were to take this brass and copper machine, carry it into a perfectly soundproof, utterly empty room, and leave it there in the dark, it would continue to swing with the exact same relentless rhythm. Its physical nature is absolute. It possesses a fixed structure that does not require an audience, a reflection, or a context to be exactly what it is. We walk through our waking lives harboring a deep, comforting assumption that our own psychology operates by this exact same physical law. We believe that beneath the shifting moods, the polite conversations, and the various roles we play throughout the day, we possess a solid, unchanging core of personality. We firmly believe that if you stripped away the rest of the world and placed us in absolute isolation, the fundamental, authentic you would remain perfectly intact, ticking away in the dark. But the architecture of the human mind is not built like a copper-wound machine. Your sense of self is not a hidden object you simply inherited at birth, sitting deep inside your chest waiting to be discovered. It is a fragile, continuous illusion that requires a very specific, external ingredient to exist at all. Without this ingredient, the very concept of you would evaporate. Imagine the psychologist George Herbert Mead in the early 20th century, quietly observing the profound, chaotic development of young children. He was watching the slow, mysterious process of how a human infant wakes up to their own existence. Most thinkers of his time assumed that identity was a private, internal discovery. They believed a child simply looks inward, feels their own thoughts, and suddenly realizes their own individuality. But Mead noticed something entirely different, something that upends our romantic notions of the self. He observed that a child's sense of self develops not in isolation, but strictly through interaction. You do not learn who you are by sitting alone in a room. Mead realized that in the earliest stages of life, a human being has no concept of an internal I. An infant experiences hunger, warmth, and light, but they do not recognize themselves as a separate, bounded entity navigating the universe. That recognition must be actively taught, and it is taught entirely through the reactions of other people. From infancy, humans are voracious social learners. A baby copies a facial expression, reacts to a tone of voice, and watches the eyes of their caregivers long before they understand a single word of language. Through these countless microscopic interactions, the child begins to see how the world responds to them. This process is known in psychology as social mirroring. Identity is formed through this social mirroring. We construct our internal I by absorbing external feedback and how others perceive our me. Mead argued that you cannot build a sense of self without first understanding the me, the objectified version of yourself that exists in the eyes of society. Only after you have gathered enough reflections from the outside world can you turn inward and construct the I that responds to those reflections. You construct yourself by taking in external feedback and making it a permanent part of your internal story. This means that your identity is not something you discover alone, it is something you helplessly co-create with your environment. When a child is repeatedly told they are helpful, they absorb that reflection, begin to view themselves as a helpful person, and actively seek out more ways to help. When a child is constantly criticized or ignored, they internalize that invisible shadow, carving self-doubt into their own identity, even when there is no objective reason for it. Relationships, whether they are deeply nurturing or quietly destructive, leave permanent marks that shape not just how you act, but how you fundamentally see yourself. This reliance on the outside world does not stop when you reach adulthood. The psychologist Gordon Allport raised a deeply provocative question that highlights this invisible dependency. If a person is entirely alone on a deserted island, do they actually have a personality? They might have private thoughts, biological preferences, and daily habits, but without another human being to interact with, the very concept of personality begins to dissolve. We tend to think of personality as a fixed set of traits that we carry around like items in a backpack, introverted or extroverted, kind or cold, patient or impulsive. But these traits do not exist in a vacuum. They only spark into existence in the space between people. Your generosity is not a physical object inside your brain. It is a dynamic behavior revealed only when you have someone to share with. Your patience only exists when someone else is there to test it. Because identity is co-created with the environment, you are forced to constantly revise and adapt your sense of self depending on the social context you are standing in. You might act with quiet authority at work, become loud and outgoing with your closest friends, and shrink into a reserved, cautious observer around strangers. We often judge ourselves harshly for this, worrying that we are being fake or hypocritical, but you are not being dishonest. These are simply different expressions of the exact same mind, shifting because your identity is fundamentally dynamic. You do not have a single personality that you carry unchanged through life. You have an identity that is expressed, adapted, and refined only in the presence of others. You exist in the spaces where people meet. The human mind is desperate, biologically hungry for these mirrors. Every time you enter a room, every time you post a thought into the digital void, every time you speak to a stranger, you are throwing out a signal and waiting for a reflection to bounce back, confirming that you exist and telling you what kind of shape you hold in the world. Your personality, your deeply held values, and even your emotional reactions have been absorbed from the people who surround you. The boundaries of your inner life were drawn by the hands of your culture, your family, and your peers. Even the language you use to think your most private, secret thoughts was not invented by you. As the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan theorized, the unconscious mind is shaped entirely by the world outside you. From the moment we begin to speak, we step into a structure of language, expectations, and cultural norms that existed long before we were born. The very words you use to define your identity are borrowed from the society that raised you. Your mind does not just speak, it echoes the world that first taught it how to speak. This brings us to a deeply unsettling implication about the ghost in the machine. We fiercely defend our individuality. We proudly claim that we are unique, self-made authors of our own destiny. But if your identity is entirely constructed from the reflections of others, if your internal I is just a reaction to the external me, then what is actually beneath all of those layers? Think of your personality like an onion. You peel back the layer of your professional self, the layer of how your friends see you, the layer of your family's expectations, and the layer of your cultural language. You peel back every reflection until you reach the center, expecting to find a glowing, solid core of pure, untainted selfhood. But if you stripped away the reflections and opinions of every person you've ever met, there might be no core personality underneath you at all. If you took away the social mirror, the glass through which you view your own soul would simply be an empty, transparent window into the dark. Without the accumulated echoes of the outside world, the distinct, colorful personality you consider to be you would evaporate into silence. You are not a solitary copper metronome capable of ticking away in a soundproof room without an audience. Your psychological boundary is completely permeable. You are a beautiful, chaotic collage of every interaction you have ever had. You are a symphony of echoes, forever dependent on the world to tell you who you are. The ancient metronome continues its steady rhythm on the heavy wooden desk, a physical object completely indifferent to the world around it. But you are not indifferent. You cannot be. You require the gaze of the world to maintain your shape. And if our identity depends entirely on others, what happens when society assigns us the wrong label? The ancient copper-wound metronome sits undisturbed on the heavy wooden desk, swinging back and forth in the quiet dark. Tick, tick, tick. It strikes the silence at exactly 60 beats per minute. It is a machine of pure, objective reality. It does not matter what you think of the metronome. It does not matter what label you assign to it or what assumptions you project onto its brass weight. It will simply continue to tick, bound by the unyielding laws of physics, utterly indifferent to the opinions of the room. We navigate our waking lives harboring a deep, comforting assumption that our minds possess this exact same structural integrity. We believe that our sanity, our fundamental grasp on reality, is an objective, undeniable fact anchored deep within our biology. We assume that sanity is a physical property, much like the beat of a healthy heart or the swing of a pendulum. You know that you are rational. You know that you are grounded in the real world. You trust that if someone were to suddenly accuse you of having lost your mind, you could effortlessly prove them wrong simply by acting like yourself. You believe that your sanity shines so brightly, so obviously, that it could never be mistaken for madness. What if your sanity is not a biological fact at all? What if your grip on reality is entirely dependent on the permission of the people around you? In the early 1970s, a psychologist named David Rosenhan decided to test the structural integrity of this comforting illusion. He initiated a study that would shatter the psychiatric community and reveal a terrifying blind spot in the human mind. He gathered 8 perfectly sane, ordinary individuals. They were people with normal lives, ordinary jobs, and stable minds. Rosenhan sent these 8 individuals to walk through the heavy, locked doors of different psychiatric hospitals across the United States. When they arrived at the admissions desks, they presented themselves with a single, carefully fabricated symptom. They calmly claimed that they were hearing voices. Based entirely on that single symptom, all 8 of these perfectly sane individuals were admitted to the psychiatric wards. Some were diagnosed with schizophrenia, others were labeled with bipolar disorder. The heavy doors locked behind them, sealing them inside the institution. Their real identities remained a complete secret from the medical staff. And then the true phase of the experiment began. The moment these pseudo-patients were admitted to the wards, They completely dropped the act. They stopped reporting any voices. They behaved exactly as they normally would in their everyday lives. When doctors and nurses interviewed them, they answered every single question honestly. They showed absolutely no signs of mental illness, emotional distress, or psychological fragmentation. They were simply ordinary people, sitting quietly in a hospital, waiting to be recognized as sane. Logically, you would assume that trained medical professionals, experts in the landscape of the human mind, would immediately spot the mistake. You would assume that the objective reality of their sanity would outshine the initial misdiagnosis. You would assume that within a day or two, a doctor would review their perfectly normal behavior, apologize for the mix-up, and send them home. This did not happen. Instead, Rosenhan's study, famously titled "On Being Sane in Insane Places," revealed that we cannot reliably distinguish the sane from the insane once a label has been applied. Once these individuals were branded with a psychiatric disorder, that diagnosis became an inescapable lens. The doctors and staff no longer saw human beings, they saw only the disease. Psychiatric hospitals, for those locked inside them, are incredibly monotonous environments. To pass the slow, dragging hours, the pseudo-patients would occasionally walk up and down the sterile hallways. The medical staff observed this perfectly ordinary human behavior, but they did not see boredom. They wrote in the medical charts that the patients were exhibiting nervous pacing, recording it as a symptom of their underlying psychiatric condition. When the participants sat quietly in the common rooms taking notes about their experiences for Rosenhan's study, the staff did not see researchers at work. They did not ask what they were writing. Instead, they documented that the patients were engaging in compulsive writing behavior, twisting a quiet, rational task into pathological evidence. Once labeled with a disorder, perfectly ordinary human behaviors are effortlessly reinterpreted by experts as symptoms of mental illness. The label warped the environment completely. The hospital staff were often too busy, too overworked, or too detached to see the objective reality standing right in front of them. In a twist of profound, tragic irony, the only people in the hospital who successfully recognized the sanity of the researchers were the actual patients. Several of the genuine residents on the ward suspected that the researchers were faking it, occasionally whispering that they must be journalists or professors secretly checking up on the hospital. The patients could see the truth clearly, but the experts, blinded by their own diagnostic categories, saw only the sickness they expected to see. These 8 sane individuals were kept hospitalized for weeks. Some were locked away for months. During all that time, despite their calm cooperation and absolute normality, none of them were ever identified by the doctors as imposters. They were only released when they finally agreed to accept their psychiatric diagnoses and admit they were in remission. The terrifying implications of Rosenhan's experiment strike at the very core of how we understand existence. It reveals that reality is terrifyingly fragile. Sanity is not an objective, internal state that you can carry around like a passport. Sanity is a social mirror. It requires the environment to reflect your rationality back to you. If you strip away the reflections and opinions of the people around you, your internal reality loses its anchor. And if society suddenly holds up a warped mirror, if the world assigns you the wrong label, the structural integrity of your identity simply collapses. Think of the existential horror hidden within this dynamic. We walk through life believing that if we are quiet, polite, and reasonable, we will be treated as rational beings. But the theater of the absurd proves that once the world defines you as abnormal, even your quietest, sanest moments will be used as proof of your sickness. Imagine sitting in that locked ward. You try to calmly explain to a doctor that you are fine, that it was all a misunderstanding. But to a mind filtered through the lens of a clinical diagnosis, Your calm explanation is just a sophisticated defense mechanism. You decide to sit silently and read a book, proving you are peaceful. The charts record that you are withdrawn and antisocial. You become frustrated and raise your voice because you are trapped in a room you cannot leave. The staff immediately documents an aggressive, psychotic episode. There is no behavior, no word, no gesture that cannot be twisted to fit the label. You are no longer the author of your own actions, the label is the author. The boundary of what is considered mad is not drawn by the state of your mind, but by the expectations of the room you are standing in. The hospital environment itself reinforced this distortion, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where the institution stripped away the participant's humanity, replacing it with a pathological file. If perception is an externally guided hallucination, as we discovered earlier, then social labels act as the ultimate guide. When an authority figure looks at you and expects to see a fractured mind, their brain will physically hallucinate that fracture onto your behavior. They will not see your truth, they will only see their own prediction. You become a prisoner of their perception. The metronome on the heavy wooden desk continues to tick, 60 beats per minute. A perfect, unyielding rhythm in the dark. It is immune to the opinions of the room. But you are not a machine of brass and copper. You are a fragile, biological consciousness that desperately requires the world to understand you. You cannot survive in a vacuum, and you cannot easily survive a world that has decided you are broken. We are so heavily dependent on the social mirror that we often bend our own behaviors, our own beliefs, and our own realities just to make sure we align with the expectations of the people holding the glass. This desire to conform to the rules of the room leads to even darker psychological depths. The ancient copper-wound metronome continues its solitary vigil on the heavy wooden desk. Tick, tick, tick. It swings back and forth in the quiet dark, striking the silence at exactly 60 beats per minute. The metronome possesses an absolute, unyielding integrity. It will not suddenly speed up because the room is cold, nor will it slow down because it wishes to be kind. It is bound by the inescapable laws of physics, a fixed instrument moving through the world with perfect predictability. We walk through our waking lives harboring a deep, desperate assumption that our deepest values possess this exact same structural integrity. We believe that beneath our shifting moods and fluid identities, we possess an internal, ironclad mechanism known as a moral compass. We assume that our sense of right and wrong is an objective, biological fact, anchored deeply within our character. You know that you are a good person. You trust that you would never intentionally inflict agonizing pain on an innocent human being. You believe that if you were ever ordered to commit an atrocity, your innate morality would act as a physical barrier, rising up to stop your hand. You believe your conscience shines so brightly that it could never be eclipsed by the shadows of the room. But what if your moral compass is not a fixed mechanism of brass and copper? What if your fundamental sense of right and wrong is entirely dependent on the permission of the person standing next to you? Imagine the psychologist Stanley Milgram in the early 1960s observing an ordinary, quiet volunteer walking into a sterile university laboratory. This volunteer is not a criminal. They are a teacher, a postal worker, or an accountant, an everyday citizen with no history of aggression. They have been told they are participating in a simple memory experiment. They are seated in front of a massive, intimidating metal console covered in switches and dials, which they are told is an electric shock generator. In the adjacent room, hidden behind a wall, sits another person, an actor, though the volunteer does not know this. Standing right beside the volunteer is a man in a crisp, grey lab coat holding a clipboard. He represents the absolute authority of science. The instructions are given. Every time the person in the other room answers a memory question incorrectly, the volunteer must flip a switch to administer an electric shock. With each wrong answer, the voltage must increase. The experiment begins. At first, the shocks are mild, but as the mistakes accumulate, the voltage climbs. Soon, the actor in the other room begins to react. They grunt. Then they shout. As the voltage pushes higher, the unseen victim begins to scream in agonizing pain, desperately begging to be released. Finally, after a massive shock is administered, the victim falls completely silent, implying unconsciousness or something far worse. The volunteer is terrified. Their hands are sweating. They are visibly trembling, torn apart by the sound of human suffering. Their moral compass is screaming at them to stop, to refuse, to walk away. They turn to the man in the lab coat, pleading for permission to end the session. But the authority figure does not threaten them. He does not point a gun or raise his voice. He simply looks at the clipboard, meets the volunteer's panicked eyes, and calmly repeats a single, flat phrase. The experiment requires that you continue. And the ordinary, quiet, morally upright volunteer turns back to the console, places their trembling fingers on the dial, and flips the switch to administer what they believe to be a lethal electric shock. Milgram was not testing memory, and he was not testing cruelty. He was testing the terrifying architecture of obedience. He wanted to understand how ordinary people could commit profound acts of harm. What he discovered shattered our comforting illusions of innate human goodness. Despite the clear, agonizing signs of distress from the victim, a staggering 2/3 of the participants continued flipping the switches all the way to the maximum voltage. These were not evil people. They were not psychopaths or sadists. They were perfectly ordinary humans who found themselves trapped in a structure where the social context and the presence of perceived authority effortlessly overrode their personal conscience. The study revealed an uncomfortable, devastating truth about the human mind. Under the right conditions, the vast majority of people are capable of following orders that completely violate their deepest moral values. They do not do this because they desire to cause pain, but because they feel helplessly trapped by the social structure around them. This phenomenon extends far beyond a man in a lab coat giving direct orders. Your morality is not just vulnerable to authority figures, it is entirely subjugated by the physical and social environment you are placed within. Consider the work of psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who wanted to know what happens when you take good, ordinary people and place them in an evil environment. In 1971, Zimbardo transformed the basement of a university building into a mock prison. He took perfectly normal, healthy student volunteers and randomly assigned them to play the roles of either guards or prisoners. There were no scripts to follow. There was only the immersive, isolating environment of authority and subjugation. What happened next was so deeply disturbing that an experiment planned for 2 weeks had to be completely shut down after just 6 days. The students assigned to be guards, who had tested as perfectly empathetic and ordinary just days before, began exhibiting increasingly aggressive, humiliating, and psychologically abusive behaviors toward the prisoners. The prisoners in turn became passive, emotionally distressed and traumatized. The environment itself became the author of their cruelty. Zimbardo's findings highlighted a terrifying psychological reality. People's behavior can change drastically depending on the system they are placed in. Cruelty and abuse are rarely the result of individual personality flaws or inherent evil. They emerge almost automatically from situational forces. When the rules, expectations, and power structures silently permit harm, the human mind will seamlessly adapt to commit that harm. Ordinary people can do extraordinary damage not because they are inherently bad, but simply because the environment enables it. We construct elaborate, self-congratulatory narratives about our own virtue. When we read about historical atrocities or watch footage of a quiet volunteer torturing a stranger, we comfort ourselves with the ultimate psychological defense mechanism. I would never do that. We believe that our empathy is stronger than the room. We believe that we would be the one to stand up, throw down the clipboard, and refuse the order. But this is an illusion generated by a brain that currently feels safe. Here lies the profoundly unsettling implication that dismantles the ghost in the machine. The strong, unwavering moral compass you pride yourself on is likely just a byproduct of a safe environment. You believe you are fundamentally good, but in reality, you have simply had the luxury of living in a context that rewards goodness. If you were placed into a system that demanded compliance, surrounded by an authority that absorbed the responsibility for your actions, your conscience would evaporate. Under the right pressure, you are terrifyingly compliant. You are not the solitary author of your ethics. Your moral boundaries are drawn in shifting sand, constantly renegotiated by the expectations of the room you are standing in, the uniform you are wearing, and the silent permissions granted by the society around you. Understanding this behavior is not about excusing harm, it is about recognizing the devastating reality that human morality is not an internal object you possess. It is a performance dictated by the invisible forces of the environment. The metronome ticks in the darkness 60 beats per minute. It will never compromise its physical rhythm no matter who enters the room. But you are not made of brass and copper. You are a biological machine, deeply desperate to belong, desperate to survive, and terrifyingly willing to surrender your soul to the architecture of authority. If our morals, our memories, and our bodies are all fragile illusions, what is left of us? The ancient copper-wound metronome sits undisturbed in the moonlit room, its brass weight swinging through the deep shadows. Tick, tick, tick. It strikes the silence at exactly 60 beats per minute. Throughout our journey into the dark theatre of the mind, this steady mechanical rhythm has served as an anchor. It has acted as a reassuring symbol of physical permanence, a promise that solid objects have undeniable limits. We walk through our lives relying on the deep, comforting assumption that we, too, possess this exact same structural integrity. We believe that beneath our shifting moods, our polite conversations, and the various roles we play, we possess a permanent, unchanging core. But as we have peeled back the layers of human psychology, every comforting assumption about your reality has been systematically dismantled. We have discovered that the universe you perceive is merely a controlled hallucination projected by a brain trapped in a silent, pitch-black vault. We have seen that your sacred personal history is a constantly mutating fiction, rebuilt and overwritten every single time you remember it. We have learned that your deepest emotions are blind, biological reactions, and your moral compass bends effortlessly to the architecture of the room. Even the physical boundary of your flesh is an arbitrary map, easily tricked into claiming dead, inanimate matter as its own. If your perceptions, your memories, your body, and your values are all fragile illusions, what is left of you? To answer this final, ultimate question, we must look not just at modern psychology, but back to a legendary paradox of ancient Greek philosophy. Imagine the heroic King Theseus sailing his magnificent wooden ship into the harbor. It is a cherished vessel, a towering structure deeply tied to his identity and his countless triumphs. But the sea is unforgiving, and time grinds everything to dust. Over the years, the ship requires relentless, ongoing maintenance. A wooden plank slowly rots in the salt water, so the crew pulls it out and replaces it with a freshly carved piece of timber. Then a mast snaps in a violent storm, and a new one is hoisted into its place. The heavy canvas sails tear, the iron nails rust, and the wooden oars splinter. One by one, year after year, every single board, rope, and nail is swapped out for new materials. Eventually, a day arrives when there is not a single atom of the original material left floating on the water. Is it still the ship of Theseus? You might instinctively say yes, it has the same name, it sails the same waters, and it serves the exact same purpose. But then imagine a strange twist. What if a scavenger had secretly walked the shores collecting all those old, rotting, discarded planks? What if they reassembled those original pieces into a ship on the beach? Now there are two ships. One is made entirely of brand new parts, and one is made of the original materials. Which one is the real ship? For thousands of years, philosophers debated this riddle as a neat, abstract intellectual puzzle. But it is not a puzzle about maritime engineering. It is a terrifying mirror held directly up to your own existence. In the modern era, the psychologist Dan McAdams observed the human lifespan and recognized that this ancient paradox is playing out violently inside your own head. McAdams was studying how people understand their lives, and he helped develop what is known as the theory of narrative identity. He observed that human beings desperately crave a continuous sense of self. We are terrified of fragmentation. We need to believe that the I who existed 10 years ago is the exact same I who exists today. We believe we are the ship, sailing steadily across the ocean of time. But McAdams realized that the self is not a fixed, unchanging core. It is not a physical object you carry around in your chest. The self is an ongoing narrative. You do not simply live your life, you actively, helplessly shape the story you tell about who you are. McAdams argued that people build a sense of identity by constructing a personal narrative that desperately tries to connect the past, the present, and an imagined future. But this story is never carved in stone. It is a live, reconstructive edit. You highlight specific events, leave other moments in the dark, and continuously reinterpret your past experiences based entirely on the message you are currently trying to construct. A painful failure from your youth might once have felt like the devastating end of your potential. But years later, after you have found success, you mentally rewrite that exact same failure into a necessary, profound turning point about resilience. A quiet childhood might be remembered as tragically lonely or beautifully peaceful, shifting constantly depending on the mood of the present moment. You are not a completed book. Your identity is a live edit, adapted to fit what society expects to hear and what you desperately want to believe about yourself. You are the author of a biography that changes its plot every single time you turn the page. And it is not just your psychological narrative that is being replaced plank by plank. The paradox of the ship is a literal biological fact. You are not the same person you were 5 years ago. Over time, through the relentless microscopic machinery of biology, almost every cell in your body has died, been flushed away, and replaced by new matter. The physical tissue of your brain, the wet machinery that generates your consciousness, is in a state of perpetual metabolic turnover. Your thoughts have completely shifted. Your beliefs have evolved. The habits you once clung to have been abandoned, and the people who once served as your social mirrors have come and gone. You have replaced your physical planks, your emotional sails, and your intellectual masts. Everything that once constituted your reality has been quietly discarded and swapped for something new. This leads us to the ultimate, most profound, and unsettling implication of our journey through the mind. You walk through the world holding a deep, comforting illusion that you are a singular, unbroken entity traveling linearly through time. You go to sleep, the world goes dark, and you wake up feeling like the exact same person who closed their eyes. But the science of the mind tells a much darker, much more beautiful story. Every atom in your body has been replaced, and every memory has been rewritten. The self you believe yourself to be is nothing more than a fleeting arrangement of biological static, an externally guided hallucination desperately trying to make sense of the void. You are not the same person who went to sleep last night. When you close your eyes and surrender to the dark, that specific, temporary version of you simply ceases to exist. The neurochemistry shifts, the conscious lights turn off, and the continuous narrative is broken. And when the sun rises and the fast pathways of the brain boot up the simulation of reality once more, a completely new consciousness sparks into the dark. You are a completely new consciousness that merely woke up and inherited the memories of a ghost. You look at the reconstructed past, stitched together from decaying fragments of episodic memory, and you simply assume you were the one who lived it. You read the diary of a dead stranger and claim it as your own. You are the ship of Theseus, sailing an endless, dark ocean, constantly replacing your own planks, forever dying and forever being reborn without ever noticing the transition. The narration returns to the quiet, moonlit room. The ancient, copper-wound metronome continues its steady rhythm on the heavy wooden desk, ticking at exactly 60 beats per minute. But the ticking no longer represents a simple machine measuring out an objective, physical universe. It represents the beautiful, haunting persistence of a human mind, a mind that constantly hallucinates its own reality, endlessly rewrites its own past, and continuously gives birth to itself in the dark. You've been watching 2 hours of the most relaxing psychology facts to fall asleep to. Don't forget to like and subscribe,